Welcome to History Respawned. I'm your host, Bob Whitaker. This episode considers Machine Games' recent venture into alternative history, Wolfenstein: The New Order. I'm joined on the show by two experts, Evan Torner, an assistant professor of German Studies at the University of Cincinnati, and Nick Heckner, a PhD candidate in German Studies at the University of Michigan, and author of several essays on the depiction of World War II in video games. Before we begin, I want to warn viewers that this episode includes spoilers for the game, as well as graphic depictions of violence. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome to the episode. I'm joined today by Evan Torner and Nick Heckner. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
So today we're going to be discussing Wolfenstein: The New Order, which was developed by Machine Games. And The New Order is a Wolfenstein game in the sense that it's a first-person shooter that features B.J. Blazkowicz fighting Nazis. But unlike previous iterations of the series, which occurred during the Second World War, The New Order takes place in an alternative version of the 1960s, in which Nazi Germany has won the Second World War. So I was going to start the episode by going through some of the game's counterfactuals. And then we're going to move on at the end of the episode to discuss kind of the general phenomenon of Nazis, World War II, and video games. So I guess my first question, and I'll pitch this to Evan, how well does the game reflect what we know about Nazi Germany's actual post-war plans?
Well, Bob, I would say the game reflects a hyperbolic version of what you would see as the Third Reich's plans for the world. Obviously, it's a science fiction game on a fairly interesting premise of the counterfactual history. What if the Nazis had won the war? And in that respect, we're suddenly forced into looking at what the Nazis actually planned and actually accomplished. And what they actually planned with the kind of Lebensraum concept, right, living space, was to transform primarily Russia into the breadbasket for a Europe that would be completely dominated by the Third Reich, and that all countries which had minority German-speaking populations, which would extend all the way down south to Südtirol, what's that in English? The Tyrolean Alps, all the way over to Belgium, to the Baltic states, which used to be part of the greater Prussian Empire. So this was a kind of return to an imagined German normality that would then be entirely self-sustainable. And I think that idea of sustainability we don't usually think about when we think of the Nazis, but really independence, complete financial independence, not being dependent on any world system, but only on the resources that a state itself could provide for itself, was very important after the disaster that was the global financial depression of the 1930s. So in that respect, I see, the Third Reich's plans for especially for Europe as ones of economic sustainability, which of course required military subjugation of every single state that would threaten that.
Right, and the game depicts the continued military occupation of places like Poland, of England, of course, and then also places within Western Europe, including France. I mean, do you think, again, we're talking counterfactuals, do you think that type of, military occupation with ground troops ever present, do you think that type of military occupation would have continued had Germany won the Second World War?
Well, the issue is, as of even the early 40s, Germany was already depleting its own resources in terms of personnel and just general resources, right down to food, steel, and that sort of thing. So I always take the approach. Yes, there were lots of grand plans, but in prioritizing certain plans over others, and it to some degree, military troops were allocated to the concentration camps that could have been better used on the Russian front, if you want to mince military history, or troops that were allocated to defend Germany were actually taken off the front and used to shoot a film in 1945 or 1944-45 called Kolberg, right? And so there are all these, it would say, inefficiencies that you see within the Third Reich system that don't quite add up to an idea of the personnel being used and the resources being well used. So the answer is if given unlimited personnel and resources, yes, the Third Reich had lots of plans that it could have implemented, but unfortunately for it, and fortunately for the rest of the world, the Third Reich was unable to realize that just due to sheer lack of resources.
I would actually disagree with you, Evan, if you say that Kolberg, or the soldiers stationed in the movie production of Kolberg, was a bad decision in terms of military deployment. I think, if anything, it shows that it was a very, very desperate attempt to motivate the home front, because Kolberg was one of those very, very big production movies that was supposed to motivate people to stay with the struggle as everyone was struggling and as resources were getting really scarce on the home front. So I think it was actually a pretty sound decision to make the movie as big as just possible to motivate people at home, because the war was coming home, So I think it was a reasonable decision to pump up those kind of efforts.
No, I think you absolutely raised an important point, and that is that half of the entire basis on which the Third Reich rested was an enormous public relations and propaganda campaign, and that that they would not abandon that up until the very end. And I think you see traces of that throughout the very ideologically charged spaces of Wolfenstein. That there are posters everywhere, documents everywhere reflecting a very specific media engagement. That the Third Reich was movie made. It was movie mad and made for the movies. And so it's a cinematic space, but they were also constantly producing cinema, newspapers, photographs, anything that would tell a larger aesthetic story of this political entity.
That's a fantastic point, Evan, actually. And there's one poster that struck me at the end. On the moon, actually, there's an advertisement for Wolf cigarettes, and it says, "Wenn man ihnen die letzte Zigarette anbietet, sind sie auf der falschen Seite." So when you're being offered the last cigarette, you're on the wrong side. So this is a very clever allusion to this Verflechtung, this intermingling of commercials for the for economical interests and for political propaganda on the other side, which allows either side to not be completely obvious.
Right, it's interesting that we might consider these kind of extreme emphasis on propaganda to be inefficient, as you said, Evan. But it seems like it was built into the very fabric of at least the domestic success of the Nazi regime. So what may look like inefficiency from the outside actually made a lot of sense within the German state. Right,
and I think what then you look at something like Wolfenstein, where they're building entire new. They're building the Nautica facility in London, right? They're building the moon bases, all of these very highly technically complex apparatuses, and you're thinking, where the heck did they get all the materials and the money? And of course, the assumption behind the game is if you can convince the people. And if you have not only coerced but also cowed all of your opposition and coerced your people into doing this for you, you can accomplish anything, absolutely anything.
Yeah, and a couple of the interesting enemies that the Nazis have managed to dispatch in Wolfenstein: The New Order are the United States and then all of the countries in Asia as well. I mean, how feasible would this have been for Germany, and would this have been a mission for them in the post-war period?
Well, I think the very notion of dispatching the United States and of all the countries in Asia, again, achieving true world domination, harkens back to this Philip K. Dick novel called The Man in the High Castle, in which Germany and Japan are able to actually divide the world in half, and which is awesome for them, obviously. So then they've each taken over half of the United States as part of the bargain. But then they're in a sort of Cold War situation where they are squabbling with each other now over what they now own. Philip K. Dick is making a obvious statement about the pointlessness of imperial domination, but in sort of actual historical feasibility, there were strong anti-Nazi sentiments in the United States. But it was not inevitable that the United States would have entered the war as it did.
Right.
And that is one of the major counterfactual associations that you can draw from it. So The Man in the High Castle takes this premise that the Third Reich is able to successfully invade because of United States apathy and inability to mobilize to the level that it was able to do in the 40s. And I don't think that then Asia would have been far behind if the Nazi war machine had been operating sort of perfectly. But on paper, the Third Reich was figuring that the United States would not engage to the degree that it would, and that it also could be pretty easily corrupted and confused.
In fact, Evan, that's what is funny in the McCarthy hearings. One thing that was brought up against people was the term premature anti-fascism. So if people were against Hitler before they were supposed to be against Hitler, that is, before Pearl Harbor, people were accused of being communist sympathizers because it was a premature version of anti-fascism.
Yeah. And of course, it's not so incredible to believe that America would have wanted to remain neutral, even given the atrocities committed by Nazi Germany during the Second World War. I mean, what is always so frustrating for me is having to remind students that it was Germany that declared war on the United States, not the other way around.
Yeah.
And that FDR was desperate to get involved in Europe, but he had to find a way to get Germany to declare war on him before he could actually do that.
Absolutely, and there was also an American Nazi Party, a groundswell of support for German independence and similar appeasement kind of attitudes to what you then also found with Chamberlain in the UK at the time. So
this game, The New Order, it also includes very graphic depiction of a concentration camp. And this concentration camp includes all of the hallmarks that I think are associated with the Holocaust in the public's imagination, including the incinerators, including the number tattoos on the prisoners. And what did you two make of the kind of the depiction of this concentration camp in the game? And I guess feeding off the counterfactual part of this game, do you think that the Nazis would have continued with the Holocaust had they won the Second World War?
I'm going to give this question to Nick because he's written about this idea of World War II without concentration camps as imagined by the Wolfenstein games. So.
Sure, but I mean, right now they're calling my bluff and giving this really, really graphic really graphic depiction of one. To answer your question, this is all speculation, obviously, but the Nazis did not come up with the idea of the Holocaust until fairly late in the game. The Wannsee conference where this was blueprinted was fairly late on, and this highly industrialized Shoah, as we know it, was a very late idea.
And it was considered by them to be a war emergency measure.
Exactly, that's right. And I'm not sure if that is something that they had wanted to keep up, or if I'm really uncomfortable using that term, but if it would have been a necessity for them to even do that. Forced labor camps, sure, I can absolutely see why they would continue to do that. This was one of their pillars of of their economic success from a very early point on. But I'm not sure why they would want to have those death camps. I can't see the reason for that. Having said that, I found myself struggling really hard with that level and its depiction. I've seen similar depictions of fictionalized labor camps in the latest Killzone Shadowfall has these images. In Homefront, the PlayStation and Xbox 360 game is fairly graphic in similar images, but I found it really hard to think about that level on the usual terms of what does it do, why does it do these things, and I found it really hard to not be offended by it, because it does similar things to what Nazi exploitation, like the Ilsa movies and these things do, but I found myself being touched in a very visceral way by it. The bodies and the portrayal of characters in there, they hit really close to home.
I agree. I was actually quite disturbed by it, as was my wife, who was looking over my shoulder as I was watching this. And I think that that viscerality was a game design goal. That not only would you have in this particular Wolfenstein the usual Wolfenstein experience of shooting Nazis until to your heart's content, as these sort of endlessly disposable human bodies, but then also experiencing with your own avatar the horrors of the concentration camp. You are literally strapped down and tortured and then left to die in a pile of bodies with a knife sticking out of you. And in that capacity, they cross a line into making, I guess, all these different emotional experiences equivalent, and this is a false equivalency. So I agree. It was pretty offensive. I'm speaking as an American Jew on this front, but at the same time, I think it was there for them to call Nick's bluff and say, okay, we will include the Holocaust in it, and you will experience it. You will be, first-hand witness to that.
However, when you that's a very interesting scene you're bringing up. When you get strapped down in this chair, but I forgot what the guy's name is, but there's this...
The knife.
The knife, of course,
the
knife. Right. That is basically a panache of two different scenes. One is Black Ops, the strapped to the chair scene from Call of Duty Black Ops, and it's very much it's Reservoir Dogs, right?
Yes.
It's right from Reservoir Dogs, being strapped to the chair, and the guy knifes you in the face over and over again. Like it is building on genre rather than on historical representation, and as such, yes, we will include the Holocaust is also a bluff. It's not, because they're including the Holocaust by proxy of genre.
Yeah, and I would also say, I study the films of Uwe Boll, the infamous game.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, right. No, I am one of the Uwe Boll scholars, I guess. There are not that many of us, and Dr. Boll made a film called Auschwitz that was that came out in, I think it was 2011, 2012, and was more or less resoundingly booed and banned at the Berlinale in the subsequent year. It got a terrible reception, and it's partially because he decided to just make a day in the life of a concentration camp and brought the camera inside the gas chamber, and so this kind of idea of doing a kind of one-upping, I'm going to bring you an even more emotionally visceral experience, crosses certain lines of the sacred and the profane, I guess, and just says, okay, well, we're going to give everybody this emotionally vicarious experience regardless of whether or not you're sacrificing the same sort of moral object of that experience.
I think I would have been okay with bringing the camera into the gas chamber if it had been sincere, But this is building on blueprints, on insincere genre, on things that I've seen before in gangster movies and horror movies and all those things. So it doesn't stand out. It's just pushing buttons in the same way that other movies have before, and it's not teaching us, or not even teaching. It's not bringing us anything new about the Holocaust, certainly.
So here we are comparing the New Order's depiction of concentration camps to Uwe Boll's movies, which I can't imagine any worse comparison that you could make for this game. Is there any chance that a video game could do a representation of concentration camps, the Holocaust, in a way that is not just pastiche? And do you have any recommendations?
Well, one game that I admire on this front is the recent indie favorite, Papers, Please.
I just thought of that too, Evan.
Yeah, right. Which documents the mundane bureaucracy of you stamping people's passports in the middle of a war-torn, or rather very tense, fictional Eastern European country in the early 80s. And I think Papers, Please, even though there's nothing Holocaust about it, gets at what we're talking about, where you have to make moral decisions as this officer, and you are financially penalized for it, and also socially penalized. So you have the peer pressure and the salary, right? You're being paid to marginalize these people, and you're being paid, and then you're also ostracized by your peers and by your country, and interrogated if you don't do it. So you wind up doing it, and doing it well.
The banality of evil, right?
Yep,
right.
I call it Banality of Evil, the game. It's Hannah Arendt's Banality of Evil, the game, yeah.
So another thing about Wolfenstein: The New Order is that much of the game's technology belongs to science fiction, right? There's depiction of laser weapons, there's robotic dogs, and there's even this thing called super concrete, which is discussed in depth but never really explained. But how much was the real-world technology depicted in the game, including atomic bombs, space flight? How much were these types of technologies within the grasp of Germany had they won the Second World War?
To answer your question very succinctly, super concrete, no. Atomic bomb and space flight, definitely. Basically, the trajectory of the technology that they're drawing is assuming that Werner von Braun had stayed and completed his research entirely in a successwerner German Reich. At which point that would have meant.
Can you give us a background on von Braun? I mean, just for the viewers.
Werner von Braun was a German scientist working on rocket projects, basically carrying on the work of another guy, Hermann Oberth, who was a rocket enthusiast, but then wound up inventing the sort of first major prototype for a launchable space rocket. And that space rocket actually found its first representation in Fritz Lang's Woman in the Moon. And Werner von Braun then developed rockets for the Third Reich. You know, he was one part of this kind of generation of apolitical physicists who didn't care what the government really was doing. You know, it was sort of amoral in this capacity, and you could discuss about whether or not that is immoral. But in effect, Werner von Braun helped develop the V1 rocket, which was used as a stationary rocket that was used to bombard both London and Antwerp successfully, and then also the V2 rocket, which was to be one that basically a guided missile, a homing missile. And this rocket plan was more or less, abandoned and co-opted by the U.S. military after the defeat of Nazi Germany. And Werner von Braun was basically taken home to the United States, given a lab and lots of resources. And just like with the Manhattan Project that evolved the atomic bomb, was told, go forth and make us these things, and eventually his rocket work led to the first moon launch. There's an almost direct line of his developments at NASA, what would become NASA, to then the launch of the moon. With regards to atomic weapons, there was certainly a uranium project that had been developed by numerous physicists there, including Werner Heisenberg of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And Heisenberg actually demanded in 1942, this is something I got when researching for this, in 1942 it was Heisenberg who demanded that the Third Reich develop an atomic weapon so that more German casualties could be avoided, because obviously he was seeing all of his friends who were drafted in 1939 as physicists into the Wehrmacht get slaughtered, and he wanted a way out, similar to the United States' eventual solution of having to not invade Japan by bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Right. So going back to this issue of kind of space flight, do you think, I mean, again, posing counterfactuals, do you think that going to the moon would have been of interest to Nazi Germany? I mean, because the lunar missions themselves were kind of a byproduct of the Cold War, right? So it wasn't really a mission of the United States at the outset to land on the moon. It just became one during the early 1960s. And but this game, The New Order, it makes it seem as though this lunar mission was a part of kind of Nazis' ideas about the future.
Yeah, and I think so. The Nazis were developing things that were like lasers. I mean, the most absurd of which was the James Bond weapon, the Sun Gun, that satellite that's used in Die Another Day. Actually, if you've seen that movie, to reflect the sun and as a sort of laser on the Earth's surface. And these were all real, real developments. They were all in more or less drafted among Third Reich weapons scientists. But I always like to think of it as the Third Reich, as Ernst Fraenkel once called it, a Doppelstaat, in which you had both this very strong political body, obviously the party directing everything under Hitler, the dictatorship, but then you also had a strong group of private interests that benefited from military contracts. So it was basically, if the government was putting up a military contract, they developed a technology that would that would be convincingly effective to the government for them to continue to finance them. And Siemens and Krupp in particular made so much money through these sweet government contracts. And so I figured the Nazis, if they wanted to, could put people on the moon in the 60s. I mean, that bit of counterfactualism is not outlandish, but you're right. The motive to do so would be from the Cold War, and I don't know how much we can ascribe the motives, especially with this idea of financial independence, if the moon and its lavish expenditure would be also part of their plans. But who knows? I mean, even if you just look at Albert Speer's plans to redesign Berlin, which would also manifest itself in the Wolfenstein game, you see that there was going to be enormous expense at entirely restructuring public space. So restructuring the moon, not that, it's not inconceivable. And of course, Iron Sky already took that to its natural end.
Yeah, I would actually like to pitch in there, because it's not so much that it was a historical, it doesn't come from a historical origin that the game would depict that, but there's a rich, literary and filmic tradition of depicting the Nazis as being in some kind of mission to get to the moon, to colonize the moon. In fact, Heinlein, the guy who wrote Starship Troopers, he wrote a novel called Rocket Ship Galileo, where the Nazis actually go to the moon, and he published that in 1947. So that's a very early, start for that. Of course, Iron Sky is the culmination of all the efforts in the perfect masterpiece to get the Nazis to the moon.
I suspect masterpiece there is in air quotes, Nick.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, let's switch gears here and talk more generally about the depiction of Nazis in World War II in video games. And Nick, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what makes Nazis such a popular enemy in video games in particular.
That is a very good question, and I think it's just because Nazis do make very attractive enemies. I mean, one of the major joys of playing video games is having a clear goal, a goal that is attractive to strive for, right? So if the enemies are very desirable to overcome, that makes you want to play the game more, right? So the Nazis are so attractive as enemies because World War II has been the ultimate just war in the American imagination, right? We call the veterans of World War II the greatest generation. And that is probably not only because the Nazis' war crimes are so profoundly disturbing by themselves, but also because they translated into visuals so well that we could all witness them and their viscerally disturbing awfulness so well that we all know how terrible their crimes were. So right now in post-11 America, the lines between enemies and allies and friends are extremely blurry, right? Now we have an enemy, the Nazis, which is very, very, very clearly evil, and which reminds us of the time when we knew exactly what to do, and nobody would doubt that we might not be doing the right thing. So I think that is a fantasy that is a relief for many people these days. And also, if you think of the depiction of these powerful Nazi armies, which is why also you have this sci-fi technology, right, which exaggerates their immense power. We kind of fantasize about them as really, really powerful enemies, and the projection of oneself onto the avatar and onto the enemies don't always work quite as neatly as we think they do, right? So the fact that the Nazis conquered almost all of Europe, it fascinates people, right? So if we have this what-if scenario in books like Fatherland and the ones that Evan talked about earlier, we can partake in fantasies like, so what if we didn't have ethical concerns? How advanced would we be? What if we could do weird experiments on people? What if we had still slavery and those kind of things? What kind of technological power would we then have? So it is kind of a repressed kind of fantasy that subconsciously is still at work when we play against Nazis, against these super powerful enemies. When they take over the world, we subconsciously might think, well, could we have been a super race if we didn't have to follow ethical concerns? Pretty much also like the Batman myth operates, right?
Yeah, and I think that that hits it spot on, and I'm glad that Nick went there, where there is a sort of identification capacity. It oftentimes when we consume something ironically, it's a preface until or it's only a matter of time before then it becomes consumed sincerely. Which is not to pronounce all things ironic bad, but that it is actually a cultural process that happens over time. Where you lose the self-knowledge that makes something ironic. Adorno and Horkheimer, even state pretty explicitly that the Third Reich came as partially one aspect of the Enlightenment, which is instrumental rationality, as Nick is talking about, the will to create technology that is useful to human purposes, no matter how perverse those purposes are, and so that then you begin to fantasize. How could you be a lot better if you didn't have to obey all these moral strictures? And I find this interesting then when you compare Blaskowitz and his underground resistance cell versus the Nazi threats. The Blaskowitz and the underground resistance cell use suicide bombing terrorist attacks. You are basically a lone school shooter through most of the. I'm going to point it out, right? You are a lone shooter running through these these bases shooting people who don't deserve to live. And this is, you can explore, I would say, this slightly softer form of fascism in fighting the hard fascism of the National Socialists.
So one form of evil validates another lesser form of evil.
And not only that, but that lesser form of evil is a lot of fun to perpetrate, just to shoot people in the face.
I just did an interview with John Romero, and he talked about how the bodies of the original Wolfenstein 3D and that they're spread all over the floor are not actually, a sadistic goriness, but he just wanted the game to be more realistic, the bodies not to disappear. And then I asked him about, but Hitler's killing is really, really gory, and it gets replayed and all that. So why is that? And he said, because he deserved it. So I think this is exactly what Evan is talking about, right? You get to gorily mow down these people because they are up a notch, more evil than you. So you get to be a suicide bomber because, after all, they're the Nazis. They deserve it.
Yeah.
So, on the one hand, the depiction of Nazis in video games is comforting because it allows us to have a clear-cut enemy. And then also at the same time, it allows us to kind of live out power fantasies of what kind of state you could have if you weren't held back by moral strictures.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say that people that play these games actually wish for slavery to happen and all those things, right? But there is a what if kind of thing, right? That doesn't mean that people want to start putting people in chains, but it means, what if we didn't have to be good people? I mean, these kind of fantasies, I think, are part of the human experience.
Well, I mean, Evan, you said that it's positive that there's so much spoken German in this game, but you two both had a little bit of an issue with the written German, particularly in the advertisements and the propaganda spread throughout the game. I wonder if you could both talk a little bit about that.
For me, even when you have a simple mistake like "bleib wachsam," right? Which to me, I've never seen on a poster, but maybe Nick has. There are little verbal tics where I say this sounds like a student of mine, like their German, but not exactly German's German. There's a certain otherness that can't really be captured there because of the fact that the Nazis are not still around producing more language to describe the 1960s, etc. There was another I saw on a poster, I think this was in the Moon Museum, "Nehmen Sie den Hund für einen Spaziergang."
Yes.
Right. That is a literal translation of "take a dog for a walk," but I mean, it basically sounds like you're kidnapping the dog and walking with the dog in your hands. I mean, it doesn't sound German at all in the semantic field that German has. So I think that, every time I read something in there, if it was written in sort of the older German script, which is called Fraktur, that then I didn't read it so carefully. But then when it was written in straight Roman scripts, like you would, or Helvetica even, I read it very closely for its grammar, and I realized that these Nazis have forgotten some German after having Germanized the world.
I actually disagree on this one with you, Evan. I think there is a long trajectory from Wolfenstein 3D where actually its software and its handbook had a disclaimer that it apologizes for the bad German to all the German players out there, and which, funny enough, they couldn't even play because it was banned. But over, Wolfenstein 2009, where they had propaganda posters saying "Unterstütze deine Truppen," which is the direct translation from "support your troops," to this one, where I thought it was fairly successful in creating a German sphere that built on the Kraft durch Freude kind of things, the how would you joy through
Strength through joy.
Yeah, strength through joy, right? Kind of things, and like culturally sound what Nazi German language and imagery would look like in the 60s. I mean, Evan, you were obviously more successful than me hunting down things like Nehmen Sie den Hund für einen Spaziergang, which is obviously obscene German, but what I was able to see, I was quite impressed with, actually, and especially the voice acting, which covers Austrian, German, and like other accents, and is much more inclusive than the general either American voice actors and then a couple of Bavarians thrown in there that you usually get in Nazi German representation in American movies. I think this is a part of the game which, by the way, I generally quite liked, minus the really offensive concentration camp level. That was really well done.
Yeah, I'm going to echo that. Actually, I like I said, I was criticizing the written German. The spoken German is amazing in terms of the diversity. Even though a lot of times they are, summoning their troops and saying these kind of pat military phrases, but it was clear that they got real German voice talent.
Well, that's going to do it for us here at History Respawn. Thanks again to Evan Torner and Nick Heckner for joining us on the show today. Please tune in for more episodes.